I'm so excited to say welcome to our 169th online gathering for faith leaders across the country. This regular gathering is called Courageous Leadership, and it's sponsored by ELCA's coaching ministry. I am Jill Beverlin. I use the pronouns she, her, and I am the Director of Coaching Ministries for the ELCA, and I'm so blessed to be one of your facilitators today. So friends, continuing our connection with the truth and healing movement of the ELCA, I would like to offer a land acknowledgement. I am speaking with you from a place located on the Fox River in Appleton, Wisconsin. This area is the ancestral homelands of 5 nations of Native Indigenous peoples: the Menominee tribe, the Ho-Chunk Winnebago tribe, the Potawatomi tribe, the Oneida tribe, and the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohicans and the Brothertown community. I honor and respect the diverse Indigenous peoples connected to this land on which I live. Expanding this, we each are gathered in this virtual space from all parts of Turtle Island. Because we understand that all land is Indigenous land, I now invite each of you to name in the chat the Indigenous peoples or tribal nations who were the first to care for the lands and places where you are located. Along with this, it is important that we acknowledge all of our Indigenous siblings who continue to care for this land and call it their home. And if you are Indigenous, we invite you to name your people or tribal nation in the chat feature now, so that we may see you more fully in this virtual space. So friends, through these gatherings, we have developed a covenant of how we enter and interact in this space. We are committed to creating a safer and braver space in these gatherings where we are able to bring the truth of who we are and how we are doing. And with all of this said, we proclaim that these conversations are meant to be an intentional step to live more fully into God's dream for us as the body of Christ. So with that, again, friends, I want to say welcome to Courageous Leadership. We are in for such a treat today. We are honored to have Shane Claiborne back with us. Many of you know Shane as a speaker and activist, steeped in liberation theology, as well as being a best-selling author whose work challenges us to really think about how we're using our time on earth and what walking with Jesus might really look like. And this reminds me, Jason, we need to not forget, we're also pleased to be sharing a copy of Shane's latest book with 5 of our participants today. Names will be drawn at the end of our gathering, and Jason will confirm with you if you are one of these people. So Shane, I want you to know that you are a beautiful example. You show us what walking with Jesus can look like, and your life experience lets us know that sometimes this leads us to fascinating spaces and challenges us to take some courageous stances. From working with Mother Teresa in Calcutta to establishing the Simple Way community in Philadelphia, Shane shows us that he is indeed committed to living as if he believes what Jesus said. In addition to advocating for the homeless and protesting in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and standing against war, grace now fuels his passion to end the death penalty, and he is committed to helping to stop gun violence. Shane also most recently began a new adventure in parenthood, and he and his beloved wife, Katie Jo, welcomed baby Elijah into the world just a few weeks ago. So with all of that said, Shane, again, we are so thrilled to have you back with us today, and we are honored that you are taking the time to share your thoughts with us on othering. Welcome to our space.
Well, that was so nice. Thank you. It's wonderful to see all your faces on the screen. And as you heard or might have caught wind of there, I've got my southern roots in East Tennessee in the hills, and I can't hide it and don't want to. And when the baby keeps me up all night, my southern drawl comes even stronger, I think. So here we are, and I can flash my screen around and show you. This is our little community across the street. We've been building community. We just celebrated 25 years, y'all, of community on the north side of Philly. So if you ever find yourself in Philadelphia, the city of love, as I said in the chat there, those are big aspirations to live into, but We're on the north side. Would love to have you come visit. Got all kinds of ELCA friends, and in Philly, of course, the Lutheran Seminary, all kinds of stuff. So, yeah, and I love doing this particular virtual time together because it's a little different. This talking not just sort of about the death penalty or gun violence or the war in Gaza, but talking today a little bit about our own interactions and the way that we treat other folks, the way that we disagree well, this idea of othering. So I wrote some scrap notes that are less prescriptive, no PowerPoint or 5 points or something, but just sort of some thoughts on it. And I'm excited. This kind of feels like a little family huddle. So we'll unpack it together. But I wanted to start with I think this is kind of a quintessential text on othering from the Gospel of Luke. And I'm sure it's familiar to many of us or all of us, but just kind of listen to it with fresh ears. This is Luke 18. To some who were confident of their own righteousness. I think that's important too, starting with that. Confident with their own righteousness and look down on everybody else. Jesus told this story. Two men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself. God, I thank you that I'm not like other men, robbers, evildoers, and adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give a tenth of all I get. And then it says, but the tax collector stood at a distance. He didn't even look up to heaven, but he beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. I tell you that this man, rather than the other, went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts themselves will be humbled, and the one who humbles themselves will be exalted. Well, that's one of those mic drops. You can almost just leave it at that, and we take that and roll with it. But I love that story because I think we can find ourselves in it. This idea that we're so good at saying, thank you that we're not like that person or those people. And obviously, this is the centuries old work of comparison and self-righteousness. And I think I grew up with a version of self-righteousness that is very familiar to many of us, purity culture, the sort of keeping ourselves from being undefiled by the secular world, living only, listening only to Christian music growing up. And, in the South, we said, I don't smoke, drink, or chew, or go out with girls that do that kind of thing, and it's sort of this moral purity subculture. And it was very much about pointing fingers, right? And it still is, right? Thank you that we're not like those people. But then the more I got involved in social justice work and progressive movements, I began to see that self-righteousness isn't partisan. It's got lots of different ways that it manifests itself. And there's, I think, a progressive form of self-righteousness that is like, thank you that we're not like those people. We're not like those evangelicals. We're not like the Republicans. We're smarter. We have nothing to do with the deplorables, and this kind of like there's this sort of awe, this aura of moral superiority, right? I only drive a Prius because I care about the environment. I would never drink a Starbucks coffee because they support Israel now. All this. So there's ways that we create these kind of our own purity culture. I mean, I think the left and the right have its own sort of theological policing, our own jargon and in language just to kind of test who's in and out. And some of that's, I mean, some of these are values, having pronouns on our screen, all that, these are all things that some of them are deeply good convictions and they're there for a reason. So, but I think when it crosses over to a point that they become barriers that separate us from them, that they're about our own culture of inclusion and exclusion, that we have these barriers that are, some of them are defined and some aren't. But I want to just talk a little bit about how we've, um, uh, I don't know, I guess how I've tried to think through this a little bit. And one of them, so I'm going to start by saying, no, let's know ourselves, our own hypocrisies and contradictions, and know our own evolution, right? Sometimes I think, like, what would our conversation be like if we met ourself 15 years ago? And how have we evolved? And even just thinking about that hopefully gives us a new sense of grace, that other people might also be, as scripture says, working out their salvation with fear and trembling. One of my favorite stories about knowing yourself is it's a little Rich Mullins story. I always love Rich Mullins, part because of his humility. He was always kind of uh he's just kind of knocking the idea that he was a celebrity and stuff. And there's one particular story. If you don't know Rich, by the way, he was a wonderful singer and songwriter that died tragically in a car accident in, I think, the late 90s. And I got to know him a little bit. He was a dear, dear, dear brother, and I still love his music. When I do work out, I don't work out as much as I'd like to, but when I do, I listen to Rich Mullins. And so Rich was on a train talking with a friend of his, as the story goes, and they were having sort of a heart to heart, this male accountability, confession, and they shared some deep stuff. And they're on a long train ride apparently, and they got to the station. They're getting off the train, and as they're kind of grabbing their bags, the person sitting on the beside them on the train said, they recognized Rich, and they said, "Sorry, I couldn't help but notice. You look like Rich Mullins. Are you Rich Mullins?" And he said, in that moment, I began to rehearse all of the things that they could have heard me say on the train ride, and I had to decide if I was Rich Mullins. And he says, I looked them in the eye and I said, yes, yes, I am. And it was kind of a way of saying, I'm going to own all that, right? I'm not ashamed that I'm not fully arrived at who I want to be. And I think of that, and I think there's part of that we need to protect in our spiritual environments, a place where, um, as my friend Tony Campolo says, when people tell him that the church is full of hypocrites, Tony says, "No, it's not. We've always got room for more." We've always got room for more. So that not denying that we have our own contradictions. And Tony often says that our hope is that we will be less of a hypocrite next month than we were last month, or next year than we were last year. So we're working on those contradictions. And I think the church has a lot to learn from the recovery community, Alcoholics Anonymous and other groups, that this idea that we're wounded healers, right? And that when we're at our worst, we don't beat each other down. I mean, I think that's what Christians are really good at sometimes. But like, we actually want to lift each other up. We want to catch each other when we're struggling. And I went to a young hip church a little while ago, and I couldn't help but admire the greeters at the door. Instead of the usual greeters with the programs and fancy suits and ties, they just had T-shirts on that said, "No perfect people allowed." That's what the shirt said of the greeters. And I thought, what a great message, for the first person you're seeing as you enter a worship service. No perfect people allowed. And this is also obviously very Lutheran, that this idea that we've got a sinner and a saint at war inside each of us, and so we're constantly deciding who we're going to be. But I think that ability to recognize our own contradictions, our own struggles, even the work in progress that we have been, that's a good starting point for othering, right? Because what I think typically happens is we find the best in ourselves, and we compare it against the worst in other people. I mean, it happens politically. It happens, I think, in the church. It happens almost everywhere. If we have an adversary, we're going to take the best in ourselves and pit it against them. Whereas I think the teaching of Jesus is exactly the opposite, right? That we're to find the log in our own eye. We're actually to work on our deepest hypocrisies. And I think that's why it's holy work when we confess and the sacrament of confession, right? Um, Even when in politics someone gets it wrong, when we see our own party or our own group of belonging that does something wrong and we're able to recognize it, it's powerful. I think it actually creates bridges and busts those like kind of moral superiority bubbles that we try to hide in. Um, Another thing that I've learned, I guess, about trying to break down this othering is that we become like the people we surround ourselves with. And I mean, that's no big surprise, right? You know, when we're young, we talk about peer pressure, and you know, there's a lot of negative things about it, but I think that there's all kinds of positive things about community that we rub off on each other. You know, so if we surround ourselves with people that remind us of Jesus, they help us become more like Jesus. You know, I often tell folks that community is about surrounding ourselves with people who remind us of who we want to be. So if you want to be more generous, you hang out with generous people. If you want to be more courageous, you hang out with courageous people. And I think self-righteousness is like that too, right? That if we hang out with people who have this kind of chip on their shoulder, that affects us. You know, if we hang out with people that are really cynical and only point out the worst, then that also rubs off on us. So I like to be around people who are joyful, people who are hopeful, and still people who are prophetic, you know, who are working on the injustices. But I like that old saying of Emma Goldman, if I can't dance, then it's not my revolution. You know, like we've got to protect our joy. And that I think is a part of this work of othering too, is if we, you know, can't laugh at ourselves, if we can't keep our joy alive, then um, we've already let the darkness kind of overcome us. When I got back from Iraq, which was one of the hardest times in my life, I was in Iraq during the war in 2003 when the bombs were falling on Baghdad. A group of us went to Iraq to resist the war as Christian peacemakers, and we lived in Baghdad during the bombing. So there were 900 bombs a day dropping. We saw all the horrific stuff, you know, things that mirror some of the things that we're seeing in Gaza right now. I mean, it was just heart-wrenching. And I got back from that working through all kinds of stuff. But one night when I was in a deep sleep, I'm a deep sleeper, my friends came in my room and they hung a life-size, like 6-foot poster of George Bush, this like silhouette above my bed. And so the next morning I woke up and I'm like, ah! You know, screaming. And I'm like, he's on top of me. And they could hear me yelling, you know, and I left it there though for months because every night I'd go to sleep and I'd pray for him. But I would also like remember to laugh, you know, remember that that we've got to be people who have joy even in the midst of the heaviness of the issues that we're dealing with. So, and I think it also, you know, is a way that we can leave room in our circle for folks that disagree with us, when we're able to take ourselves lightly, we're able to laugh a little bit. You know, I mean, one thing that most conservatives and most liberals that I know that are really entrenched in their ideology, one of the things that they have in common is that they've lost their joy. They don't know how to laugh. They don't know how to take themselves lightly. They don't know how to like just sit around and have a human conversation, right? So that's one thing. So this idea of surrounding ourselves with people who have joy in life. Um, the other thing I would say is that there's power in finding common ground with people that we do not agree with on everything. The current statistics are really alarming in our country. I go into this a lot in the new book, Rethinking Life, of how polarized our country is. But one study in particular, More in Common, showed that um, an overwhelming majority of both Democrats and Republicans believe that not only are their political adversaries wrong, but they are actually evil. And it went on to ask, do you think the world would be better without them? And a stunning number of both folks on the left and right said the world would be better off if we didn't have Republicans in it, or if we didn't have Democrats in it. I mean, that's a really uh, heart-wrenching place to be in our country. I think it's a dangerous place to be as well, but it's also like when we've created that much of another that we don't just think that they're wrong-headed, but we believe that they're evil, and that the world might actually be better off without half of our population, right? That's a really polarized culture and environment to live in. So we're up against some really big odds. That's why I think we've got to be creative as we think about othering. So there's a lot of stuff that I've seen crack those walls a little bit. One of my friends, Michael McRae, does storytelling workshops, and they, have some of these best practices where people share their stories together. And in the vein of Howard Zehr, the great restorative justice guru, we change lenses a little bit. So one of the stories he told me was about a big gun enthusiast, a guy who loved guns, who was a big Second Amendment guy, who was partnered with a young woman that had lost her child to gun violence. So originally, it's a really awkward interaction as they're telling stories. And they do a lot to prime the pump, right? To create a culture of listening and respect. So there's a lot of work that goes into this. But essentially, they end up listening to each other's story, and then they mirror it back. They reflect back that story to each other. Did I hear you right? And then eventually what they end up doing is telling the other person's story firsthand, just to kind of get into it, and also to acknowledge that I see you, I hear you. And as this guy who's a big gun enthusiast is mirroring back the story, first person, of this woman who lost her child, something just cracks in him, right? And he begins to really break down. And I don't know that his political views changed immediately, but I think his heart changed. And what I've found is that not many people change their mind because they lose an argument. We don't argue people into new ideas very often. But I think we can story people in, and we can move people in their heart, and our heads sometimes follow our heart. So a lot of the work that I do is storytelling. When I'm talking about or gun violence, it's centering people who have impacted, and allow stories to break people's hearts, or to crack things open, or to break stereotypes, right? When you uh, are for the death penalty, but you hear my friend Derek talk about being 20 years on death row with 6 execution dates for a crime he had nothing to do with, and eventually was proved innocent without any doubt. And it creates this kind of hiccup in the matrix, right? This kind of breaking of the idea that the system must work. And so I think those are ways that we've got to keep cracking that. So I can think of a lot of places that's happened in my own journey. But one of just strategically too, if you think about this, one of the groups that's really moving the barometer on gun violence are gun owners who are concerned about gun violence. And actually, that's what I would consider a lot of my family members now are gun owners that are concerned about gun violence. There's whole coalitions of hunters against assault weapons. And in fact, I went on a march with with a group of them that had shirts that said, "A good hunter doesn't need more than 10 rounds to shoot a deer." That's what their t-shirt said. So, we may not all agree on the Second Amendment, but if we can find some common ground with gun owners that are concerned about gun violence, it actually might be even more effective in persuading politicians and working for legislative change, that staying in our self-righteous silos might not move things as much. And it's not that we compromised any of our ideas. I mean, I'm a pacifist. I'm passionate about nonviolence, but I also believe that I can work with someone that I don't agree with on everything. And in fact, maybe we disagree with someone on 90%, but the 10% we have in common can really create a lot of energy. And just one more example of that. is my friend Ron McAndrew, who is a former prison warden, and he was an executioner. He carried out executions. That was one of his jobs. And he was absolutely haunted by it. He's still a Trump supporter, last I heard. He's still a very conservative man in a lot of political ways. When you talk to him, I mean, I kind of feel like I'm talking to a prison warden. You know, he's like, if you do the crime, you should do the time. Um, but he has so much power when he talks about what the death penalty does to those who carry out the executions, because he's done it. And I remember him saying to me, there's just no good way to kill someone. And so there's power, right, in those voices that when we disagree. So just a couple other thoughts, and then I know we want to break out and come back, huddle back together. So I often find too that when we move together to take action, we transcend some of the impasses that we have in just conversations alone. So, for instance, there's an old historic gathering of monks and religious, like nuns and traditional monastic communities. And they sort of broke out, as I understand it, in two different groups. There were the theologians and the folks that are working on the ideas, and there were the friars and the activists that are running soup kitchens and missions. And so they had these kind of breakout groups where they went and hung out together. And they said all the theologians came back absolutely frustrated and mad, and they couldn't find anything to agree on. And all the other folks that were spending their days in the streets taking care of people, they came back inspired by the ways that people were showing compassion, with new ideas with how they could take care of people. So I even saw that on a campus, a college campus, that was the young Republicans and the young Democrats were, you know, paralyzed politically, and they tried to find something they could agree on. And what they found was pretty simple, that it's cold in the winter in Philadelphia and people need blankets. So they said, let's just kind of get outside of the political entrenchments. Let's get 100 blankets and let's go down and just wrap people up, you know, that are on the street. And they did that. And it might sound a little cliche or trite, but honestly, I think it was in that action that they're able to have harder conversations now and not just get stuck in what's kind of almost the one-dimensional, as you know, as Herbert Marcuse would say, the kind of one-dimensional paralysis of analysis. And the idea is, so now at least they've got some sweat together, some compassion together. So I think that's one other thing I would say, is that when we have people that we're never going to argue each other into agreeing with us, maybe we could do something compassionate together. And maybe it's just simple, right? That we grab a pizza and we go hang out in the park and eat food with folks on the street. And so that action, I think, is good. And just a couple other thoughts in these scrap notes is that I think that proximity to the pain is clutch. We are all really good at talking about people that we don't know on almost every issue: sexuality, immigration. I mean, all kinds of issues that we have opinions about people that we may not be in close proximity to. And I'll tell you, from spending time on death row, I have friends that do prison ministries that are really conservative, very traditional evangelicals. They want folks to have a born again experience. I have other friends that are real activists that visit folks on death row. But there's almost this respect that happens, and even a kind of third way that comes when there's an execution of someone that you know. It's hard not to be heartbroken, and you end up finding this common grief, right? And even talking about the Bible differently. So I find that proximity, like just being on death row with people. One of the things I try to do is when I have someone that's got a really strong view about the death penalty, if I can get them to be a little bit closer to folks whose lives are at stake, or to someone who was wrongfully convicted, then that begins to change the conversation a little bit. So proximity. The other thing I think is helpful is keeping centered on Jesus. because there's all kinds of other, obviously I, organize a lot of my work through Red Letter Christians, which, we get our name from the Gospels highlighting the words of Jesus in red. Um, and there's something about centering around Jesus that makes it really difficult to reconcile some of the things that we get indoctrinated with, right? So like when I over and over, I've tried to reach out to people I disagree with, like Franklin Graham or Jerry Falwell Jr. And I said around the last election, I'm not as interested in just talking about the issues. I want to talk about Jesus. And I want to talk about how our commitment to Jesus shapes how we think about immigration, or how we think about gun violence, or what's happening in Gaza right now. So centering Jesus to me is a way that I can find at least a framework for conversation with people I disagree. Now, this is working with Christians, obviously. But I often find that I have more in common with non-Christians and Christians on some of these things. So trying to have a better conversation with pro-death penalty Christians or pro-gun Christians, centering Jesus is something I try to do. The other thing that I try to do on that is to stay centered around love. And this is something that can work outside of just Christians having conversations with Christians, but saying, this is the kind of refrain I keep going back to in the book Rethinking Life, is what does love require of us? So when we talk about immigration, what does love look like? What does it look like to have compassion, to love our neighbor as ourselves? And I find that maybe we can have a better conversation that is not just about, well, you don't want any borders, or you just want to build a wall. Like, what does it look like to welcome people well? And to know that when we're welcoming asylum seekers, we're welcoming Jesus, like that we're showing love. We're doing to them what we would want done unto us. So I think that nuance is really, really important. And the ability to stay grounded in love. If someone's got a different moral compass than love, then it is really hard. It's going to be really hard to find, some common ground. But I think there's a lot of people that would say that they're driven by love that interpret what's happening in Gaza different than I do. And so that's where I think I can begin to create a conversation about, what does it look like to love the children in Gaza, not at the expense of the 1,200 lives lost in Israel, but equally, right? What does it look like to say that these folks on the other side of the border in Israel, on the other side of the wall there, like their lives are just as precious as the lives that were lost on October 7th. And now we've lost, over 10,000 children in Gaza. Every one of those breaks God's heart just as much as the folks on the other side. So those are, that common foundation of love, the centering around Jesus, the proximity, to the pain. Those are all a few of the tools, I guess, that in the toolbox when it comes to challenging the othering. And I just, to go back to the story, it couldn't be more clear, I think, in the teaching of Jesus, that we're not just called to be morally right. We are called to be loving and to be humble. And I think that's why Jesus says, about the Pharisees, do what they say, but don't live how they live. Like, actually, they've got good theology, but their theology doesn't translate into love. And that's why theology alone is not enough. As Barbara Brown Taylor says so well, right? I'll kind of paraphrase her, but she says essentially that if I have to choose between loving my theology and loving my neighbor, I'm going to choose my neighbor because God never calls me to love my religion or to love my theology. And so I hope that we can have good theology, good doctrines, good religion, and good love, right? Good compassion. They're not, mutually exclusive. But there's a lot of people who have good ideas, and I'm not just talking theology ideas. There's people who have political ideas, social ideas that are really smart and really good, but they're still very mean and self-righteous. And I think just as important as being right is being kind and being loving. And so that's where I'll stop, Jill. Maybe there we can break up and talk together. Thank y'all for listening.
Shane, you have given us so many seeds and so many launching points. So friends, we are going to have Jason send you to the breakout rooms, and we invite you to share what shines for you the most from Shane's conversation today. That's going to be a really hard one right there. And the other thing that we always as coaches encourage you to do is think about how can you take some of these seeds and take them into your life, into your community, and experiment with them? How can we move the needle on this, as we say, and really practice, live into the practice of not othering others? And of course, that starts with us. But the extra challenge in this space of being courageous leaders is how do we lead differently in the communities that we come from? So friends, blessings on your conversation. Jason will bring us back so we can debrief and share a little bit more with Shane and ask maybe some specific questions of our guest speaker as well before he has to leave to lead another event. Okay, thank you, friends. Enjoy your conversation.
Welcome back. Love to hear keeping the confidences of your small group colleagues. Were there any themes? What came up for you? Or if you're feeling brave, what action step are you taking from here today?
For me, it's what does love require of us? I think keeping the love or Christ at the center of it all. It was Janice, I think, who mentioned about doing the heart on Ash Wednesday with the cross. And I think that kind of brings that all into focus.
Love that. Thank you.
Hey, it was one of the person that just asked if we could do that. And I thought, what a great idea for Valentine's Day. Yeah. What integrity between living and being. And that's, was one of the themes, is how do we do both well and think the best of all of us. Yeah.
I think for me, my next step is, there's a song like, Let There Be Peace and Let It Begin With Me. And I feel like, it really makes me want to think about what is the next thing I need to heal on myself so that I can go out as a wholesome person and hopefully create more peace in the outside of me.
Yeah, thank you, Deanna Kim. Appreciate your vulnerability.
I think modeling the power of confession. And just leaning into that. It's the willingness to say, I have places where I'm broken, and I have places where I don't see clearly, and I have places where I have prejudiced and label and judge, and just confess those things. And maybe in that process of shared confession is where we can begin to have a point of intersection with people who are different. If we can at least have shared confession.
Thank you, Andrew. Several of you have unmuted, so I'll just let you go for it. Phoebe?
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to add that I'm really going to try to lean into my humility of knowing that I don't know. Just constantly remembering there's a lot that I don't know about what everybody's going through. And that includes myself, so that to see to not necessarily expect the best of everyone, because I don't know what everyone's coming to the table with.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm gonna, in a practical way, follow up with someone here who kind of at the end of a long Sunday sought me out to complain about something, and I didn't really get the full story. So I'm going to invite that person out to coffee this week and hear a little bit more about what that was about.
Thank you, John.
I'm recalling that in the Bible, peacemaking originally was understood as creating shalom was to overcome your enemy and to reduce your enemy. I think the New Testament maintains the understanding that peacemaking involves warring, not against flesh and blood, but against the what separates us from one another, the powers and principalities that maintain borders that separate us. And I'm also become aware in my life that when one tries to break through these borders that separate people from one another, that people perceive that often as a threat, and we are risking being hurt. And the problem is how do you risk being hurt still loving those who are potentially trying to hurt you?
Yeah. Thank you, Donato. Persida?
I just want to say that I'm going to continue to examine my actions when I'm with someone, to make sure that my actions are loving and kind and welcoming. I was saying that in my group that when I came from Puerto Rico, the things I kept hearing was, go back to where you came from. You don't belong here. And that created a sense of, for me, that I would not want anybody ever to feel like they're not welcome. So I sometimes I make sure that if there's someone new, I make sure that I go to them and welcome them. I don't want anybody to feel like they don't belong. And so that's already, that experience of not being welcomed has created that in me. But am I perfect? No, I still make mistakes, and I still, have to examine how I treat others, And so I was once told that I didn't accept someone, and I went home and I examined what they said. And I realized that it wasn't that I did something wrong. There was a cultural difference. And so I had to learn something about that culture so that I could interact with that person, And so I learned. So I was open to learning. And that's what I hope to keep doing, is being open to learning.
Yeah, thank you, Persida. And then just watching our time, I know Shane's got another presentation right after this. Shane, would you like the last word?
Well, I'm just so encouraged. I'm sorry that I have a little bit of a hard stop, but I'm hosting an event at 3. So I love what the spirit of the ELCA and what you all are doing. And I know there might be folks that are not ELCA that are part of this, but just know that we'll keep the conversation going. And I'll just tell you one last story because it's close to my heart. My mom teaches me a lot about humility, and she's been with me to the West Bank and Palestine. She's been with me to death row. And I'll just tell you this really quick story from her own, like, real concrete context. The Methodist Church, is split over sexuality. It was a big deal in her church. They had Family Promise, where they welcome families that are homeless to sleep in the building. And became a big deal, though, because there was a same-sex couple that folks had difficulty with, even though they didn't have difficulty when folks were not when they were a couple sleeping together. But they, anyway, it was a big deal. And so my mom was in the middle of all this. It was going to split the church over it. And she felt very strongly we shouldn't exclude people from hospitality. Anyway, so all this happens. And then I'm at home in Tennessee we brought a bunch of folks down to play on the lake. My folks live on a lake, and we got half our neighborhood's been down there. So we're down playing on the lake. And I noticed these folks playing on the lake are all of the folks in her church that they were the more exclusive voice. And I said, Mom, aren't those all the people that left your church? And she's like, yeah, I decided, how could I expect them to show love or compassion if I can't be compassionate to them? And she was like very clear on where she stood. Everybody knew where she stood, and some of them left the church over it. But the fact that she had all these people who she's wearing them down with love. So I'll share that. And she did not lose her conviction, to be very clear. But she also thought it doesn't make any more sense for me to put up a wall to them. They wanted to come down to the lake to play, and so we let them, and we did it together. And I also think through, like, you know, part of this is also not who they are, but who we are, right? So we're not going to let someone who may be mean in their heart, you know, cause us to be callous in our hearts. So I can share that proud story of my mom, especially since this isn't a live broadcast. So anyway, but love y'all. Bless you. Sorry to leave a little abruptly, but stay in touch. Jill and Jason, all of you, bless you.
Thank you, Shane. Yep, God bless you. And friends, thank you for being on. Please know that as you leave, that you are seen, you are valued, and you indeed are loved. We look forward to being together next week when we do small groups by topic. And Jason will be in touch with you if you are one of the 5 who will be receiving Shane's new book. Just what a day, huh? I mean, couldn't we just listen to him for 4 hours straight? It was just fabulous. Yeah. So proud to have Shane experience all of you as well. Please know that.
Thank you.
Yep. God
Blessings
bless you,
to you
friends.
Assalamu alaikum.